Good evening, all of you. So as we have been told, we are about to have a discussion on history, myths, and nation, and probably in the cinematic imaginations of our country. So the speakers now don't need a different, special introduction because they have already been introduced, and both of them are film studies scholars, and culture studies is also their area of interest, and especially Rituja is interested in early cinema, and Swapna Gopinath is also interested in gender studies as well as decolonial theories. So these are the additions, or maybe something that I need to add about them as scholars. Now moving on to our session. As the title suggests, we'll be discussing on cinema. Cinema will be our basic idea, basic topic. And to begin with, maybe I just want to begin by contextualizing this cinema in a space or a context called the nation. So I would like to ask you, what is your perception or observation about the idea called called nation and the practice that you always relate to as nationalism? So how do you actually contextualize that? And then we can move on to the cinematic imaginations. Please.
Thank you, Lakshmi, and also MBIFL. So today we are here because we have published a book, and it is a book on historicals, especially in popular Hindi cinema. We have not actually gone into all the different regional cinemas in this text, which is something that I want to say right in the beginning. We are not looking at Malayalam cinema, we're just looking at popular Hindi cinema because since the beginning of the new millennium, we see a very big shift in the way in which Bollywood, as we all know, commercially called, or popular Hindi cinema, the way it has, the trajectory that it has taken, especially with regards to historicals. That's what triggered our curiosity. We wanted to know why was it happening? Why was this sudden interest in historicals? Because we definitely had a lot of historicals before also, but it did not have so much of traction among the public. So we wanted to know what was triggering it, and that is where we began this journey that has culminated in the publication of this book, which is on historicals in popular Hindi cinema, and we are trying to look at the presence and the huge popularity of historicals in contemporary India. So when you talk about that, when you talk about this connection between historicals as a genre or cinema as a cultural text and connected to the nation, I think that is where your question becomes so relevant. And thanks for asking that, because I want to sort of talk about that before we move into the Hindi historicals, actually. Because as we know, when you talk about nation as a construct, it is very important that we start understanding this concept and how flimsy it is, how important it is that we understand it, that there is nothing like a nation. The whole idea of, nation as a space, as, bound by certain emotions is something that we need to understand as not absolute. It is something very, it's a construct, of course, which has to be again and again spoken about. And over a period of time, if you look at cinema, you would see how it has happened. And even if you don't look at cinema, if you look at other cultural practices, or even at the history of Indian independence, you would see how it has been. How it has been connected, because especially with our freedom struggle, it was imperative that we start talking about a sense of oneness, sense of unity, because India, as we know, is so divided and fragmented in that sense, the India of that time, except for the fact that we had British ruling over us as a colonial entity, we had nothing in common, basically. We had different languages, which is probably the most important most fascinating aspect of India. The difference of languages. As of now, we are like sitting here, we speak Malayalam. Rituja speaks Marathi because she's from Maharashtra, from Pune. So, and I'm sure there are other people around in this ground who speak different languages. And I think that's the most fascinating aspect of it. We are so rich in the fact that we have so many languages which are alive and, like everybody is speaking it. And that is what triggered probably pre-independence, that we need to have a sense of oneness. We need to have an idea of a nation so that we can have more people joining in this struggle for independence. And everything about cultural renaissance probably was about creating this kind of an identity that is we are Indians, so let's fight for our independence. So that was probably the necessity of the hour that created that sort of an Indianness, an Indian identity, even though we all have different, like for example, we have the Malayali identity, or Kashmir has something called Kashmiriyat, or Maharashtra has something called Maratha identity. So in spite of all of that, there was something else that had to be created. That was required, that was the necessity, the need of the hour, so that we come together and create a sense of oneness. I think that is probably where we can sort of trace this whole idea of, a nation or a national self or a national entity or a national identity. Yeah.
Okay. And since we are talking about the book that was published by Routledge recently, and it's an edited volume, and actually it includes 11 chapters, right? 11 chapters, including an introduction and a foreword. And the title is like historicizing myths, right? Historicizing myths. It's a very pertinent term or a phrase that we can say. So how do you place this history? Or what is the role? Or how have we used history to shape this idea of oneness or nationalism?
We had this idea in our minds, Rituja and I, and it was triggered by this essay by Susan Sontag. She was writing about photography actually, but she did write about how a fascist nation uses cultural text in a certain way. So probably that is where we, it sort of excited us to think that this is what's happening, in a very different way, of course. So we started reading more, and we started reading her text on this particular essay where she talks about Leni Riefenstahl and her works, especially during the fascist times, and how history was being, sort of manipulated in a certain way. It's a way in which you are creating. So when you talk about a nation, there is a kind of linear narrative, because you don't want to hear about the others. Yesterday we were listening to Sugumaran Chaligada, and he was talking about the others. When you construct a nation, there is always communities, groups which remain in the margins. So the history seems to have a linearity. So as we talk about decolonial theories and we talk about pluriverses, it's important that we understand those pluriverses. And that's not happening. And as of now, we see how contemporary India would rather erase all the others. Let's not even talk about them. Let's just completely erase them. Let's use this systemic violence within to completely take them away from the mainstream. Let's not listen to them. Let's demonize them. Let's just take them out. So that we can create a particular kind of national narrative. And that national narrative is extremely violent and extremely regressive in the way in which it reduces the space for conversations. It's become so narrow that you're so scared when you try to speak. There is no way you can talk. You cannot have conversations. So when we talk about how history is being used here, that's another fascinating aspect. So you see that historicals you cannot say that historicals at no time have been all about, historical authenticity. It is always selective history. It's always selective authenticity, beginning from the birth of the nation. Because it is about how you other the blacks. Right. So right from the film in 1915, you talk about birth of the nation, and one has to remember that this is about the history of America. It is about the othering of the blacks. Right. So from there onwards, it's always selective authenticity. And the way in which we embrace biopics as a genre, which is a subgenre of historicals, and how we are happy to embrace them, and the way they have become so popular. So although we have critiqued Sanju, for example, because we know that it is not the complete history of Sanjay Dutt. It's very recent past, and we know that there's been a lot of manipulations and appropriations of this history. But we are also okay with war films. So we do have a chapter in our book on masculinities and war films and all that. And that particular chapter actually looks at how masculinities are constructed. And if you look at war films, especially biopics, you would see how there is a lot of manipulation. And then they would put the picture of the real hero at the end, side by side with the fictional hero, creating an idea in our head that this is authentic, that this is real. So simultaneously, that also brings in or kind of popularizes this alternative narrative, all about patriotism, all about war, all about giving up, sacrificing yourself for the country, and all those narratives, all those discourses around nationalism.
Yeah, thank you. I'll come back to that question of othering, the topic othering. But before that, she was mentioning about cultural texts that constitute history, or cultural texts that come into the formation of a nation especially. And what would you say about cinema as a cultural text, and how has it actually contributed or made possible this new nationalist idiom?
Right. So from the very start, I'd like to start with something as intangible as nation state is the unknowability of history. Yeah, some things that, especially while doing women's film history, we keep talking about unknowability of history. How do we know about the history that has been obscured within film history? Yeah. So, when you talk about Dadasaheb Phalke as the father of Indian cinema, one must ask a question, and a question we love to ask in our classrooms is, how do we define this fatherhood? Where are his disciples? Where are the schools trained by Dadasaheb Phalke? Is there a Phalke school of cinema? Why does Phalke become more important in the nationalist film history as compared to, say, a Patankar or Kohinoor Studios of the time? All the failed attempts at making film in the British India. And why does Phalke's attempt is almost not just legitimized but concretized as the first attempt? And that brings us to this very important question of unknowability of history. And why is it important to discuss Patankar, Sampath Patankar, virtually unknown figure in the history of Indian cinema? You have to really dig archives, family archives, personal accounts, oral history to find out about this man who was going to England to study chartered accountancy. He got unbearably seasick and decided to return to India. While coming back, he came across the most volatile substance of the period. We are discussing, the period of World War II, and that was nitrate, a substance which was used in explosives and in the film reels. Yeah. Interesting war history, and how during the World War II, because of scarcity of this substance, how it became important, how filmmaking was stalled in many nation states of the time, and how they reinvented themselves in this period. So it's very important to, why am I telling you this story? What is this anecdote which is missing from the history books of cinema important to be discussed here? I feel it is important to be discussed because it brings us to a very important question of how do we do history? how do we look at history? Do we look at history from these materials like nitrate, or do we do history by hero worshipping one man and obscuring all other failed attempts like Patankar's, like Kohinoor Studios of the time started in an fairly obscure town at that time called Gwalior. Yeah, with probably patronage of quasi feudal families and little bit help from the princely states. That brings us to another very important question of princely state cinema, which also includes, by the way, Travancore cinema. My field is, of course, Kolhapur Film Enterprise, which was funded by somebody called Shao. And what these histories do, basically, is challenge, what we are coming to, is this nation as the framework to study cinema. Yeah, it is an important framework, the national framework. I'm not denying it. I'm not saying that this framework need not be discussed, but I'm also pointing out to these other histories, the women's film history. How do we look at women figures of the time? Sulochana, Zubeda, Shanta Apte. Shanta Apte, somebody who challenged in early 1930s, this woman sat on the outside at the gate of Prabhat Film Studios on a strike, demanding for equal pay. 1930s. People, just take a pause and think about it, what I'm saying. 1930s, a woman, she wore men's trouser and a white shirt and just stationed herself on the guard's bench for 8 whole days. American media covered her at that point of time. You find this in the American newspaper archives, very interestingly, at the time when it was unthinkable for a Hollywood actress to demand equal pay. Yeah? What does this history tell us? Is she not the mother of Indian cinema? Again, as Swapna rightly pointed out, the nation has to be constantly reinvented. And that brings us to this very important topic of how is nation constructed in the cultural texts. A very interesting chapter by Swarnavel discusses this in our book, which talks about the history as seen through a film like Mughal-e-Azam, 1960. K. Asif's magnum opus. All of us are aware of it, I think fairly popular film. How does it present history? Is it like, now again, we come back to the question of unknowability of history. I will also quote here my favorite academic writer of all times, Walter Benjamin, how he talks about the present. History is always present in the present. Yeah, and it's the present which talks to the history. So while discussing Mughal-e-Azam, it becomes important to understand the secular thrust of India of 1960s and the authoritative parental figure of the nation state, which is hard to miss. Now, if you ask me from a strict hardcore history discipline perspective, there is no account of Anarkali anywhere in the historical documents, just like there is no account of Padmavati Queen in any of the history documents. But then again, this unknowability of history that we're talking about, and the history on celluloid and history of celluloid, what does it tell us? Is the question that we have tried to engage, and I hope we successfully engaged with it. Swapna brought out another important aspect of how it all started with Sontag. And remember, when Sontag was writing about photography, about moving image a little bit towards the end of her essay, she is essentially concerned with analog. Yeah, that the times that she was writing was the analog. What happens to cinematic history, the history on celluloid with the advent of digital. When each and every spectacle is created digitally for us, what does it do to us, us as a nation and the psyche of the nation state? And a very good example of this, I'd like to give you the digitally created war images. One of the films that I'd like to mention, if you've not seen, like in your own time, you can go and watch this, is the film called Panipat. Yeah, essentially a war film. Very interestingly, there is one scene where the armies of Ahmad Shah Abdali and the Maratha armies are standing face to face on this huge ground, supposedly the northern plains of Panipat. Yeah. If you look at it, you can make out that it's a digitally created image, because it's like vastness of the army is very digitally created image. Very interestingly, it reminds me the way the Maratha army stand with the saffron color and the uniformity of the way they stand, like the one hand distance and everything, reminds us of the present. It feels like you're attending a shaka or something. It's that close. And I mean, somebody like me who comes from an opposite ideology, it looks almost like a caricature of the shaka. But of course, that is not how it is perceived. And how the Ahmad Shah's army is digitally created, how it is in the tone of gray, black, and these are the digital. What is it doing? Another good example, almost phallic representations of the cannons of the Maratha armies, and history tells us otherwise. Like, they lost very badly. But of course, the war and the film gives us a narrative visually without much of the dialogue. I'm not even coming to the dialogue parts of it, just the visual creation of the entire aesthetic, the aesthetic of fascism, which is clearly visible in this, or the digitally created the fire, the funeral, the fire for Queen Padmavati to walk serenely inside, like such a beautiful creation, the aesthetics of it, rightly pointed out as aesthetics of fascism, where these women just walked very serenely. Remember, pregnant women, young women, children who walk inside this, the fire that is created. I mean, I've seen that kind of excited faces of women when they go for shopping, probably not inside a fire.
Yeah. Fire.
Yes.
Can I just add to that? It's a very beautifully choreographed scene.
Absolutely.
It's like a trance, actually, women walking in a trance towards the fire. You would see the music is also kind of anthem-like in between, makes you want to go and walk into the fire, And I have had, because I teach film, I've had students asking me, very conscious about their gender identity, very feminist, they would proclaim themselves to be feminist, but they have asked me, when I speak about this film, they've asked me, like, but what's wrong with it? It's a choice. When you put this question of choice, then you have to explain how you are being, sort of influenced by this kind of narrative, and how you think it is a choice to give up your life. So, as you mentioned about technology, I just wanted to add a bit about it, because if you look at the history of cinema, you would see that probably it's in Weimar cinema and later fascist cinema that technology was, the political leadership realized the potentials of this technology, cinema as a technology, how it kind of makes you think that this is all real. And they were probably the first ones who started, having these photo ops with film stars and all of that. If you look at Hitler and all of that, they used to take these pictures with them, and how the state realized the potential, how the state started intervening. And the kind of aesthetics that you see in Weimar cinema is something that we have talked about in our book. You can probably buy the book and read it. But the book actually, we have tried to look at how Weimar cinema has used it. The kind of images that they have used to sort of help create this cult of a leader, a male leader who is like a paternal figure, and how you start accepting that authority. So you have images where there is this protagonist who walks up to the mountain, and there is sunrise, and there is this aura of a leader who's waiting to be your savior, that sort of an image. And I feel that this is something that we see right now. I was actually talking about this, Rituja, about a film like Home. For example, in Kerala, a film that was so praised by everyone for the way in which it looks at the father and the children, and I thought it was a very interesting example of how we talk about the father. Your father is not respected if he is just an ordinary man. Your father must have done some heroic act to gain acceptance. And you have the climax where this father is somebody who's a hero. So your father can be an ordinary person, still you can respect him, but not think that, you have to be obedient all the time. You don't have to be always obedient of your father or your parental figure. So discipline is something that we have so ingrained ourselves we have been conditioned to think that as a child you have to be disciplined. I don't think any disciplined child has ever created anything new in life.
Yeah, we have been talking about creating the single leader, or maybe kind of singularity or narrative singularity. Have you ever observed regional cinema resisting that? Is regional cinema following the same pattern of creating or moving towards a homogeneous identity creation, or are these cinemas resisting with regional or local histories and pluralities, many realities, maybe not just as per the history part or based on the history, but many other aspects like caste, class, gender, so many other intersections. Have you ever observed that?
I won't call it just regional cinema, because that term comes, it's a loaded term when we use the term regional, but cinema from other languages, once with the advent of sound, and before the advent of sound, I would say cinema within Bombay Presidency and outside Bombay Presidency. Because we are talking about, when we talk about silent cinema, we are essentially talking about pre-independence period. Definitely countered a single nationalist narrative. The narrative which is so ingrained that we study cinema through that framework. And especially in this regard, I would like to talk a little bit about princely state cinema. Very little work on princely state cinema has been done. Whatever has been done, one of my colleagues, I'd like to mention her name, is Yamini Krishna, who's worked on Hyderabad cinema. I'm working right now on Kolhapur Film Enterprise, where a certain kind of cinema, which was not essentially nationalist in nature, was more interested in the regional politics, in the regional acculturations of identity, was taking place. Not always, but many a times the cinema was progressive in terms of gender when they were talking about women. For example, Kohinoor Studios, all failed films were all women oriented. We were talking about silent cinema. Similarly, the women film financiers in these regional acculturations that we are talking about is another interesting subject. And it brings us to another extremely important question of what is Indian modern? Yeah, was there anything Indian modern? And if yes, then what is it? One of the ways to study it is probably through these regional acculturations. Because here's Shahu, pioneer of anti-caste movement along with Phule, supporters of British essentially. Yeah, they looked at cinema as an important medium, especially Shahu. He starts first, he finances the first film company in Kolhapur. Interestingly, all the founders are non-Brahmin, come from artisanal castes, and drawing different identities when they call nation state. There is a very interesting word here I would like to talk about. In Marathi, there is a word which is borrowed directly from Persian. It's called Vatan. Yeah? Vatan essentially doesn't mean nation in Marathi. It means your village, your locality. So when you say, you miss there's a nostalgia for Vatan, it is essentially all tangible that you've experienced. The river, the mountains, the fields. And this cinema talks about all these things. It definitely talks about, it does get nationalist over a period of time as sound comes. And it stops challenging and becomes more and more influenced by the framework of Bombay cinema, which is nationalist in nature. I'm reminded here of another film, Sant Tukaram, 1936. Another very interestingly, a film which won accolades in Venice Film Festival and was praised by none other than Mussolini. He wrote a letter in the praise of the film, and the letter is still preserved, by the way, in the National Film Archives of India, which is being destroyed by the current central government. So talking about these histories, it becomes important to understand what Sant Tukaram was all about. Here's a Bhakti poet who was essentially put into a nationalist narrative that suits Gandhi's nationalist movement of the time. So, we again come back to my favorite, Walter Benjamin, and how present is constantly talking to the past. Yeah.
Yeah, and since we are talking, your discussion is based on your book, and the title goes like Historicizing Myths in Contemporary India, Cinematic Representation and Nationalist Agendas in Hindi Cinema. So we have this two major terms like history and myth. And how do you place historicals as a genre in cinema?
So basically, we did a lot of discussions around, a lot of conversations around this two concept of history and myth, because we think there is more of historicizing of myths that is happening, and sort of mythologizing of history. Certain selective histories, sort of being made into myths, into taking characters into this legendary status. This is something that's happening right now in India, and the whole idea of what a nation state is right now, and the whole idea of how patriotic you are to that nation state, and how you're constantly being audited for your sense of patriotism and your national identity. So we wanted to bring that into our work. So basically that's what we were trying to do here. So when you look at this relationship between history and cinema, as she said, how regional or the different languages that we have around, and how it has constantly been appropriated with to create a kind of nationalist narrative. And as you come to contemporary times, there is a retexturing that is happening, and there is a kind of homogenization. So many of you may not agree with me when I say there is this homogenization that is happening, because we talk about neoliberalism and we talk about contemporary times all about heterogeneity. We say we want diversity, but when you talk about the national nationalist narrative, it is not about heterogeneity. Heterogeneity is merely a very superfluous thing, which you can see only in the commodity, as commodity. But beyond a commodity, what we see is that it is all homogenization. So the kind of narratives that we have, especially in the context of historicals, are extremely homogeneous. So if you had a film like Garam Hawa, if you look at early cinema, although we do know that a lot of histories have been erased, or a lot of histories have not really been talked about in cinema, especially Dalit identities, like almost nil. But at the same time, there were more conversations of, religious identities or Muslim identities, if you look at it. That's why I mentioned the film Garam Hawa, because if you look at how it talked about the Indian Muslim, it was not the other. The Indian Muslim was never the other. The Indian Muslim, there was always the Pakistani Muslim, who was the other, who was the hostile Muslim, but the Indian Muslim was always part of India. So if you look at historicals, that's what they have been doing. There is this very patriotic Indian Muslim in the picture. But as of now, we, especially post 2000, what we see is that that Indian Muslim is no longer found. So the Indian Muslim has become the other now. So as I said earlier, the retexturing, as she was talking about technology and how technology is being used for this purpose. So there is a very linear, unidimensional, homogeneous kind of an Indian that we are talking about now. Now this is the only Indian that we see. And if you see how the urban Indian is created right now, especially the urban Indian, this perfectly fits in really well.
This is what I wanted to ask. I told that I'll come back to this question of othering. And maybe religion, gender, caste, so many different kinds of othering that has been happening, and how Muslim within the nation has become another. And especially when you look into the history or maybe the trajectory of development, we see the secular socialist times of the idea of secularism being spread through the films, early films, later it becoming political, and later 70s and 80s again becoming political, and post 90s you see as you said, the two different kinds of Muslims, patriotic Muslims as well as the foreign Muslims. So in the contemporary scenario, as you said, we have the Muslims within India, our own citizens, treated as others. So and what about, how can you connect this religion or caste, and also gender, and how would you place all these kinds of othering in this nationalist paradigm, the way in which it is being questioned? Can you, anybody, maybe Rituja, can you just respond to that? How do you actually connect gender, especially gender, and gender not just as a different entity, but in an intersectional position where you place this Muslim, gender, or the Dalit, whatever, the different kinds of identities that we have, and how do you place this othering in many different stratas within the nationalist discourse?
Right. So, this othering is very, again, I would point out a few essays from the book, beginning with Swarna Wells, how he talks about Mughal-e-Azam and the secularism of Mughal-e-Azam, situated in the 1960s. And then we come to a film like Padmavat, which brings in the almost not just othering but villainization of the Muslim figure. With gender, I would like to point out another essay, which is my essay in the book on the film Razi, where a woman's body, a Kashmiri woman's body, is used for the nation in this espionage drama. And it's interesting how espionage and the bodies of women function. Why is it always more popular, more interesting to have a woman spy? That brings us to this very important question of women in Hindu nation, women in Hindu Rashtra, and their place, and How does it work in the confines of family when a spy has to marry into a Pakistani family, consummate her marriage, work in the service, she's there in the service of nation, and the whole choice, this whole politics of, see, again, an alleged story, allegedly true story, based on a novel written by Harinder Sikka, about a woman in 1970, before 71 war, actually went to Pakistan. We will never know the facts of this story because spies are never documented in any documentation. So it's again, this question mark is always there. But there is certain enigma when a woman spy is involved. Now you have another film based on espionage, something called Mission Majnu or something, I believe, no, on the OTT platforms. The saga is never ending. Espionage works in the construct of nation. Nothing works like the mysteries of espionage. There's so much of glamour attached to it. I mean, think of Mata Hari, think of all other. Why Mata Hari? Think of Noor Inayat Khan. One of the women spies who worked for the Allied forces, had ties with India. She was great-great-granddaughter of Tipu Sultan. History always has the ways to surprise us, to throw ironies at us. How the great-great-granddaughter ended up in the concentration camp. How the great-great-grandfather fought against the British a century earlier, and there's a film on this espionage. There's an espionage drama on this too. So yeah, coming back to the question of gender and othering of Muslims, of course, from around 2008 onwards, we see an increase, and of course, things after 2014 change drastically in terms of this Muslim figure in the historical genre of particularly Hindi cinema, Hindi popular cinema, where villainization is not just verbal through dialogues, but also how digital is used. As one of our writers, Anushtup Basu, points out about digital retexturing of past. Yeah, and what does this digital retexturing does? The dark gray surroundings around the Muslim characters, their eating habits, the almost unrealistically cruel depiction of each character, always tied to today's value system. You know, something that an author like Audrey Trishke talks about when she writes Aurangzeb's biography. She talks about this, that how do we look at an historical figure? Do we look at historical figure from the present, which we always do? And cinematic, history on celluloid, I'm afraid cannot be divorced from that present. Historians can, but history on celluloid, we always, in fact, when we look at historicals of today, the contemporary historicals after probably 20 years, 25 years, hopefully in better times, historicals will be good texts to look at what present times were all about. And when I say present, I don't talk about the historical, which is Tanaji, a 16th century, but I'm talking about like today, what Tanaji today looked like, a Bahujan icon in Maharashtra, completely Brahmanized for the Hindu Rashtra. Yeah, and that's another essay by one of our friends, Meg, which talks about this Bahujan icon of Tanaji in Maharashtra, local hero. Let me tell you, Tanaji is also, in Maharashtra's history, Tanaji is also used very interestingly by the communists to organize against the construction of Mulshi Dam. in 1920s. He's used by RSS again to organize for the same cause. And so, you know, that present will never go from the history. Yeah? But then now, in today's times, when Tanaji is released in 2018 and it gets Best Film National Award in 2020, what is this Tanaji talking to? Is more about the present, because he's made into a Hindutva icon from a Bahujan icon.
Yeah, that's the point. That's the whole point that your text is actually describing or addressing.
Yes.
Okay. So, what do you think is a major miss that you feel in your text? Probably you have actually, especially it has a very good forward by
Anjum Rajbali.
And it's a very good forward which actually summarizes the entire trajectory of the development film as a genre, and especially historicals, how historicals actually define the nationalistic concerns. And what do you think are the major things that you couldn't actually bring into this particular text? As I understand, it has 10 different essays, plus one foreword and an introduction. So what is a major aspect that you think that you missed out?
When we were thinking about this text, we wanted the foreword to be written by somebody who's not an academic, you know. So we went for Anjum Rajbali, who is a script writer, who has written some really good scripts in Hindi. And we got him to write. So he read the whole text, and, you know, sort of it felt good for us as well, because it was a practitioner, not just an academic. Because when you talk about cinema and, you know, cinematic text and its depiction or its narration of history, it's not just about a person looking at history. It's about a group of people. You know, cinema is not just filmmaking is something that involves a lot of people, you know, a lot of technicians. So it's a lot of people doing a work and a lot of people watching it, you know. So these two aspects of filmmaking makes the text so important. The narrative is so important there. So we wanted somebody from the industry to look into it, and so he wrote the foreword actually. And of course, there are a lot of things missing in our texts, because it's got only 11 chapters, including the introduction, and we have not been able to look closely into class identities, or we have not looked much into the almost complete absence of Dalit history. Of course, there's nothing to work on also if you look at Dalit history and historicals. So there are these different identities that we have not really looked much deeper into. And also this aspect of biopics, which I think, you know, like we feel that we should probably work on biopics as a complete edited text, because there's so much to talk about, you know, especially about this creation of this masculinity in biopics, you know, a particular kind of identity is created. So, which we hope we will sometime do in the future, because biopics is again a very prominent, popular sub-genre of historicals right now. Yeah.
And since this is an edited volume, can you just say something about the contributors and the major concerns that the chapters address?
Yes, so I think I basically spoke about a little bit about everybody. I think I missed something, is one of the chapters that deals with politics of true stories. Yeah, which is Damini is looking at, Damini Kulkarni, she's looking at how the politics of true stories, like films like Padman, films like Chandrayan, and mostly played by Akshay Kumar quite comically. How do these true stories play out in creating present histories? Yeah, who are these common, quote unquote, common men? Mostly men, sometimes, rarely women. And what do these true stories talk about? Then, of course, there's a very interesting chapter by Urvi Mukhopadhyay which talks about medieval in the film. You see, medieval has been sort of the focus period on celluloid, especially in South Asia for a long time. I'm thinking of Sohrab Modi's Yahudi, I'm thinking of so many films of Pendharkar on Shivaji. Medieval remains a very contradictory period. But again, when we talk of period, and I like to go to the very first, like what I said about the periodization of history itself, the linear history. Without these constructs, the periodized notion of the history, the linear history, a nation cannot be invented. A nation is invented on the basis of these constructs, the idea of linear history. Because what linearity does is gives you a start point. You know, it gives you the narrative of a golden period, a golden past, which never exists. But which never exists for any region. Let's not even call country. Golden past is the biggest myth. And upon this myth, several myths are created in past and in present. For example, Make America Great Again, which first of all, you're acknowledging that there was a great time. But if you look at the birth of nation, you actually look at extremely horrendous time, not great time at all. Similarly, the construct of India as Sone Ki Chidiya, or you know, the golden sparrow, or this construct is extremely important, and this construct is impossible without the linearity of history. So we need to, I mean, this is the time when people like Amitav Ghosh are already writing about this, that how do we write about history? Do we write about history through things, through memories, through other sources which we considered as the politics of primary and secondary source is also something that we need to look at. Yeah.
Yeah, and since both of you are academicians, just one last question. What do you think, or how do you think this work of yours, your text, would contribute to the academic field and for further research and also new knowledge creation?
So a lot of people from the academics have been telling us that there hasn't been many texts on historicals. So especially Indian historicals, and I think it was about time somebody worked on it, and I'm very glad that we could be those people who initiate a conversation on historicals, and we are hoping that more people will work on it. You know, like then there is a huge gap, especially even in Malayalam cinema. You know, right now we need more scholars who work on Malayalam cinema and not just do content analysis, but move beyond. Because we do have, when I speak to my friends back in Pune about film studies departments, and I tell them that we don't really have many film studies departments in Kerala, they are shocked. Because they ask me like, oh, this is a place that has produced such great filmmakers. How come you don't have a film studies department? So putting film studies within the context of English departments, I don't think it works. I think we need to have film studies departments which looks both at content and techniques, at form. Because I think most English teachers are not really equipped to talk about the formalistic devices of cinema, the technicalities of filmmaking. So we need more people who talk about both, and film studies departments should be there that talk about, you know, all these different genres of films and, you know, their political, ideological dimensions as well.